My name is Arthur, and I will never, for as long as I live, forget the sound of that laughter. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was something far worse. It was a quiet, suffocating wave of second-hand embarrassment and outright scorn that washed over the entire town hall, a room thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. That was the day I spent my life savings, every last cent of it, $500, on what everyone else considered a ghost. That's what they called Blackwood Manor, a ghost of a house, a pile of forgotten stones and rotting timber on the edge of town. They saw a fool, a broken-down stonemason, throwing away his last pennies on a guaranteed disaster. But I saw the only thing I had left to believe in. That single moment, with every eye in Oakhaven boring into my back, changed the entire course of my life. It drew a line in the sand between me and them, a line made of their judgment and my quiet, stubborn promise. It was the loneliest I'd ever felt, even lonelier than the day I buried my wife. The auction itself was a sad affair, a perfect reflection of our town. Oakhaven was dying a slow death, and the town hall felt like its tomb. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, slanting through the tall, grimy windows. Mayor Thompson, a man whose face was a road map of worry, was practically begging. The start-in bid for the old Blackwood place was $1, just to get the liability and the property taxes off the town's books for good. The silence in that room was deafening. Nobody wanted it. They whispered about it being haunted, about the main roof finally caving in last winter, about the poison ivy that had swallowed the walls whole. But I remembered it differently. I remembered a place of secret dreams, of promises made in the dark. So, from the back of the room, my voice feeling rough and unfamiliar from disuse, I said it. $500. A collective gasp went through the room, followed immediately by a ripple of stifled snickers. They weren't just laughing at the bid, they were laughing at me, the man who had nothing, offering everything for a pile of rubble. The town treasurer, a portly man named Henderson, whose belt always seemed to be losing a battle with his belly, slammed the gavel down with a theatrical thud that echoed in the silent room. He had a smirk on his face that I wanted to wipe off with my work-worn hands, a look of pure, self-satisfied amusement. "Sold," he bellowed, making sure everyone could hear his punchline as he pointed the gavel in my direction. "To Arthur Vance. For $500? He just bought the biggest pile of rubble in the county." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in a wave of condescending applause. It was the kind of polite, pitying clapping you give a child who's just tripped over his own feet in the school play. As I walked to the front to sign the deed, my face felt hot with shame, but I kept my expression a mask of stone. My hands, though, they betrayed me. They were trembling. I could feel the cheap paper shake slightly as I took the pen, the ink bleeding just a little on the page, like a fresh wound. The worst part wasn't the laughter from strangers or the smug look on Henderson's face. It was the sight of my own brother-in-law. Mark, my late Eleanor's brother, sat on the town council, and he looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. As I passed his table, he wouldn't even meet my eye. He just shook his head, a quick, sharp gesture of pure, unadulterated shame. I heard him whisper to the councilman next to him, his voice a low, venomous hiss I was never meant to hear but was sharp enough to cut through the noise. "The fool," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "He'll be buried under that roof before winter." That single sentence cut deeper than any public joke. This was family. This was the man who was supposed to have my back, publicly branding me an idiot and predicting my death. In that moment, a cold, hard resolve settled in my gut. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about my dignity. I signed the deed, the cheap paper feeling heavier than a block of granite in my hands. I didn't say a word to anyone. I just gave a stiff nod to the mayor, took my copy of the deed, and walked out of that suffocating room, the sound of their whispers following me like a swarm of angry bees. They saw a crumbling mansion and a broken man making his final, foolish mistake. I saw a promise I made to Eleanor years ago, under a starry sky on that very hill overlooking the manor, a promise to one day make that castle in the clouds our home. They couldn't see that. All they could see was my failure, my poverty, my grief. What would you do if everyone, even your own family, laughed at your last hope? Listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. My hands have always been my story. They're not pretty hands. They're maps of a life spent with stone, mortar, and wood. The calluses are thick as leather, the knuckles are scarred, and there's a fine, permanent layer of dust settled into every line and crease. I learned the trade from my father, and he from his. We were Vance men, and Vance men built things to last. I remember being a boy, not even 10 years old, watching my father set a cornerstone for the old Oakhaven Library. He let me put my hand on the stone as he tapped it into place, and I felt the vibration travel right up my arm and into my soul. He told me, "Son, what we build with our hands, we build with our honor. Never forget that." I never did. That was the foundation of my life. Honest work, a solid structure, and the quiet pride of seeing something strong and true rise from nothing. It was all I ever knew, and all I ever wanted. I was a young man when I met Eleanor. She was like a wildflower, growing up through a crack in the pavement. Bright, resilient, and completely out of place in a dusty town like ours. I was quiet, covered in grit from the quarry, and she was all laughter and light. She worked at the town diner, and I'd go in just to hear her talk, her voice like music over the clatter of plates. I remember the first time I worked up the nerve to ask her out. My hands were clean for once, but I still felt clumsy and rough around her. She just smiled, looked right at my calloused palms, and said, "Those are good hands. Honest hands." In that moment, I felt like the king of the world. She saw the man, not the dust. She saw the builder, not the laborer. She saw the honor my father had taught me, and she loved me for it. That was Eleanor. She saw the value in things others overlooked. We didn't have much when we got married. We moved into a tiny little rental on the edge of town, a place with a leaky roof and floors that groaned with every step. But it was ours. The first thing we did was fix that roof. I remember us up there together on a cool autumn afternoon, me showing her how to lay the shingles just right, her passing me the nails with a playful grin. When we were done, we sat on the peak, legs dangling over the edge, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She laid her head on my shoulder and whispered, "We can fix anything, can't we, Arthur?" And in that moment, I believed it. We were a team. We could take something broken and make it whole again. That little house, with all its imperfections, became our sanctuary. It was a testament to what two people could build, with a little bit of love and a lot of hard work. It was during those early years that we started our walks up to the hill, overlooking Blackwood Manor. The place was already a ruin back then, a dark silhouette against the sky, but Eleanor was captivated by it. She didn't see the decay. She saw the bones of something magnificent. She'd trace its outline in the air with her finger and tell me stories about the people who must have lived there, about the grand balls they must have held. She called it our castle in the clouds. One evening, with a blanket of stars overhead, she turned to me, her eyes shining with a dream so big it almost scared me. "One day, Arthur," she said, her voice full of conviction, "we're going to buy that place, and you, with your honest hands, you're going to bring it back to life. It'll be our forever home." I just laughed and pulled her close, but I made a silent promise to her, and to myself. I would find a way. For her, I would find a way to make that impossible dream come true. Life, however, has a way of carving its own path, often through the hardest stone. We had our daughter, Lily, and for a few years it felt like we had everything. Our little house was filled with a new kind of light. But then, Eleanor got sick. It started slowly, a shadow that we tried to ignore, but it grew until it consumed everything. The doctor's visits became more frequent, the words they used more complicated and frightening. The bills started piling up like stones on my chest, each one heavier than the last. I took every job I could find, working from sunup to sundown, my body aching but my spirit, driven by a desperate need to keep her safe, to fix this one thing I had no tools for. The dust on my hands felt different then. It wasn't the dust of creation. It was the grit of a losing battle. I remember the day I sold my father's truck. It was a beautiful old Ford, cherry red, the one he'd taught me to drive in. It was the only thing of real value I had left from him, a piece of my own history. But the medical bills were relentless. I drove it into the city and sold it to a collector for a fraction of what it was worth to me. Handing over the keys felt like I was cutting off a part of myself. I didn't tell Eleanor what I'd done for weeks. When she finally found out, she cried, not for the truck, but for the sacrifice. She held my hands that night, the same hands she'd once called honest and good, and she kissed the scars and calluses. "You're a good man, Arthur Vance," she whispered. But I didn't feel like a good man. I felt like a man who was failing the one person he was supposed to protect. The money helped for a while, but it was like trying to patch a dam with a handful of clay. We lost her on a Tuesday in spring. The world outside was coming alive with green shoots and birdsong, but inside our little house, everything went silent and gray. The silence was the worst part. It was a physical presence, a weight in every room. For months, I just moved through the days like a ghost. I'd get up, get Lily ready for school, go to whatever small job I could find, come home, make dinner, and fall into bed. The work was my only solace. The familiar weight of the hammer, the precise art of setting a stone, it was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. It was a language I understood. I poured all my grief, all my anger, and all my love for her into the wood and stone I worked with. Each nail I drove was a tear I couldn't shed. Each stone I set was a memory I was trying to preserve. Raising Lily on my own was the hardest job I've ever had. She had her mother's eyes, and sometimes, when she'd look at me, it was like Eleanor was right there in the room. I did my best to be both father and mother, but I always felt like I was coming up short. I tried to keep her mother's memory alive, telling her stories about Eleanor's laughter and her big dreams. I wanted Lily to know the woman who had given her so much light. But Oakhaven was a tough place to raise a child alone, especially as the town itself began to wither. The big mill closed down, families moved away, and the work I relied on started to dry up. The town was becoming a ghost of its former self, and I felt like I was fading right along with it, just trying to hold on for my daughter's sake. We didn't have money for vacations or fancy things, but we had our walks. Every now and then, I'd take Lily up the same hill where I used to go with her mother. We'd sit on the grass and look down at Blackwood Manor. I'd point to the crumbling towers and the broken windows and tell her, "Your mom used to call that our castle in the clouds." She believed we could make it beautiful again. Lily would just nod, her expression a mixture of childish wonder and a sadness she was too young to fully understand. For her, it was just a spooky old house. For me, it was a shrine. It was the last unbroken promise I had left. It represented a dream that had outlived the dreamer, a dream that was now my sole inheritance. The years passed, and my work became scarcer. I was patching fences, fixing leaky faucets, anything to put food on the table. The big, honorable jobs my father had taught me to do were gone. I felt my own dignity eroding with each small, desperate task. People in town started to look at me with a kind of pity. I was Arthur Vance, the widower, the struggling handyman who couldn't seem to catch a break. They saw a man worn down by life, a man whose best days were long behind him. They didn't see the fire that still burned in my gut, the promise I carried like a hot coal in my heart. They saw a man who had lost everything, but they had no idea what I was still holding on to. I saved every spare dollar I could. It wasn't much. A few dollars from fixing Mrs. Gable's porch step. A $10 bill from clearing a clogged drain. It went into an old coffee can I kept hidden under a loose floorboard in my bedroom. Over 10 years it slowly grew. It was Lily's college fund, my emergency savings, my everything. It was $500. To anyone else, it was a pittance. To me, it was a decade of sweat, sacrifice, and skipped meals. It was the physical manifestation of my will to survive, to provide, to keep going, when every instinct told me to give up. That coffee can held more than money. It held the last 10 years of my life. And that's what brought me to the town hall on that fateful afternoon. News had spread that the town was finally auctioning off the Blackwood property. They were practically giving it away, just to be rid of the liability. When I heard, something inside me clicked into place. It wasn't a logical decision. It was a gut feeling, a pull from the past, so strong it felt like Eleanor herself was whispering in my ear. I knew what I had to do. I went home, pulled out that coffee can, and poured the contents onto my kitchen table. The crumpled bills and loose change represented everything I had in the world. And I was about to risk it all on a ghost, on a ruin, on a promise made to the love of my life under a starry sky. That morning, before I left for the auction, I went up the hill one last time. I stood there, looking down at the manor, its silhouette stark and broken against the morning sky. The wind whispered through the tall, dead grass, and it sounded like a sigh. I could almost feel Eleanor standing next to me, her hand in mine. I wasn't just looking at a pile of rotting timber and stone. I was looking at her dream. I was looking at the one place on earth that held the echoes of our love, our hopes, and our future that never was. It was more than a house. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for and everything I had lost. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't let it go. Walking into that town hall, I felt the weight of every hard year on my shoulders. I wasn't just carrying the $500 in my pocket. I was carrying the memory of my father's lessons, the echo of Eleanor's laughter, the quiet burden of raising Lily alone, and the silent promise I'd made on that hill. The people in that room, my neighbors, my brother-in-law, they saw a fool. They saw a broken-down old stonemason making a sentimental, idiotic gesture. They couldn't see the architecture of my life, the foundation of love and loss, upon which this one single decision was built. They saw a pile of rubble, but I saw the cornerstone of my redemption. Their laughter, their whispers, their pity, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. As I stood there, waiting for the auction to begin, my resolve hardened like quick-setting mortar. This wasn't just about buying a property. It was about honoring a memory. It was about proving, if only to myself, that the things we build with love can endure, even when everything else has turned to dust. It was about taking the one thing everyone else had written off as worthless and showing them the value that only I could see. It was about taking my honest, calloused hands and building a future out of the ruins of the past. So when Mayor Thompson asked for a bid, and the room filled with that heavy, dismissive silence, I knew my moment had come. The voice that came out of me didn't feel like my own. It was stronger, steadier, filled with the conviction of a lifetime of promises kept. $500. The words hung in the air, a testament to a story they would never understand. They could laugh all they wanted. They could call me a fool and shake their heads in shame, but they had no idea that I wasn't just buying a derelict mansion. I was buying back a piece of my own soul. I was finally, after all these years, coming home. The first time I walked up the long, winding driveway to Blackwood Manor as its owner, the deed felt like a fragile piece of glass in my pocket. The paper was official, but the reality was a jungle. Weeds and thorny vines had completely consumed what was once a grand entrance, leaving only a narrow, treacherous path. I had to use my hands to push aside thick branches of overgrown lilac bushes that scraped against my face and arms. I could feel eyes on me. Mrs. Gable from the house across the road, peeking through her lace curtains. The Miller boys next door, stopping their game of catch to just stand and stare. They weren't waving or offering congratulations. They were watching, waiting for the show to begin. waiting for the old fool to be swallowed whole by the mess he'd just bought. The silence from their homes was louder than any laughter I'd heard in the town hall. It was a silence filled with judgment, a heavy blanket of disapproval that settled over the whole property. My first task was simple: clear a path to the front door. I only had my old tools from the shed, a rusty scythe that was more rust than blade, a dull axe, and a pair of worn leather gloves. The work was brutal. The briars were as thick as my thumb and armed with thorns that tore through my gloves and into my skin. Sweat poured down my face, mixing with the dirt and grime. I worked for hours, my back screaming in protest, and by the end of the day, I had managed to clear maybe 10 feet. As I stood there, panting and leaning on my scythe, a car slowed on the road below. It was Henderson, the town treasurer. He rolled down his window, that same smug grin on his face. "Making progress, Arthur?" he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "At this rate, you'll reach the door by Christmas. Don't work too hard now." He chuckled to himself and sped off, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and humiliation. The next day I knew I needed better supplies: a new blade for the scythe, some heavy-duty gloves, maybe a small loan for a chainsaw. I walked into the local hardware store, a place I'd been going to since I was a boy. Old man Hemlock, the owner, had known my father. He was behind the counter, polishing the glass. I laid out what I needed and asked if I could put it on my account, that I'd pay him back as soon as I got my next odd job. He stopped polishing and looked at me, his eyes full of something I'd never seen from him before: pity. "Arthur," he said, his voice low so the other customers couldn't hear, "I can't do that. You know how things are." I did know. He was telling me I was a bad risk. He was telling me that the $500 I'd spent had erased 30 years of my family's good name in his ledger. I paid for the gloves with the last few dollars in my pocket and left the rest on the counter, my face burning with a shame that felt hotter than the summer sun. It wasn't long before the town's opinion became a constant, suffocating presence. When I went to the grocery store, I could feel the change. Conversations would halt in mid-sentence as I turned down an aisle. I'd catch the whispers as I passed. "There he is," they'd say. "Poor Arthur. Bless his heart, he's finally lost it." They didn't even bother to hide it anymore. They saw me as a tragedy, a cautionary tale to tell their children about what happens when a man lets grief and sentimentality get the better of him. I started shopping late at night, just before closing, to avoid the stares and the hushed tones. I was becoming a ghost in my own town, a specter they talked about, but no one wanted to actually see or speak to. My world, which had already felt small, was shrinking down to the overgrown borders of that cursed property. The worst blow came not from a stranger, but through my own daughter. Lily had always been a resilient kid, just like her mother, but even she couldn't deflect the cruelty of other teenagers. She came home from school one afternoon and went straight to her room without a word. I found her an hour later, lying on her bed, her face buried in her pillow. When I finally got her to talk, the words came out choked with tears. A group of boys in her class had started calling me the king of the ruins. They'd made a joke about our new home being the town dump. They asked her if I was going to make her a throne out of broken toilets and rusty pipes. Hearing that, seeing the pain and shame on my daughter's face, that was a different kind of wound. It was a deep, searing cut that went right to the bone. My foolish dream was now a burden she was forced to carry. I tried to comfort her, to tell her that what they said didn't matter, that we were building something special, something her mother would have loved. But the words felt weak and hollow, even to me. How could I explain a promise made a lifetime ago to a 17-year-old girl who just wanted to fit in? I saw the conflict in her eyes. She loved me, I knew that. But she was also embarrassed. She was a child of this town, and she was hearing their verdict on her father every single day. That night, as I lay on my cot, in the one semi-dry room I'd cleared out in the manor, a cold fear gripped me. I wasn't just risking my own savings or my own reputation. I was risking my daughter's happiness, I was isolating her right along with me, building the walls of our new life out of the town's scorn. About a week after I started, my brother-in-law, Mark, finally paid me a visit. He didn't drive up the path I'd painstakingly cleared. He parked his shiny new sedan at the bottom of the hill, as if he were afraid the property's decay might be contagious. He didn't even get out of the car, just laid on the horn until I came down, wiping the sweat and dirt from my brow. He looked at my torn shirt, my scratched hands, and the monstrous silhouette of the manor behind me, and his face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. It was the face of a man looking at something deeply offensive, something that had personally wronged him. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. He was there for one reason only, to pass judgment. "Are you happy now, Arthur?" he started, his voice sharp and cold. He finally got out of the car but kept a careful distance, as if I were a wild animal. "Is this what you wanted? To become the town laughingstock? You're not just embarrassing yourself, you know. You're shaming Eleanor's memory. Do you think this is what she would have wanted? For you to throw away your last dollar on a ghost story and drag her daughter through this public humiliation?" Each word was a carefully aimed stone, and they all hit their mark. He wasn't just angry. He was personally insulted that I had dared to do something so far outside the bounds of what he considered sensible or respectable. He saw my dream not as a tribute, but as a desecration of his sister's name. I just stood there, my hands hanging uselessly at my sides. They were covered in blisters and the sticky sap of poison ivy. What could I say? How could I explain the promise that fueled me to a man who only saw profit and loss, reputation and shame? My silence only seemed to infuriate him more. "I made a promise," I finally managed to say, my voice raspy from a day of breathing in dust. Mark just let out a short, bitter laugh. "A promise to be a fool? A promise to end up buried under a pile of rotting wood? Don't you dare come to me when this whole thing collapses on you, Arthur. Don't you dare ask me for a thing." He got back in his car, slammed the door, and drove away, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. The last thread connecting me to my wife's family felt like it had just been decisively cut. After Mark's visit, the isolation became absolute. It was no longer just a feeling. It was a fact of my daily life. People I'd known for decades, men I'd shared a coffee with at the diner every morning for 20 years, would now cross the street when they saw me coming. Their gazes would slide right past me, as if I'd become invisible. I stopped going to the diner. The silence that fell over the room when I walked in was too heavy to bear. I started to feel like a disease, a walking embodiment of failure that no one wanted to catch. The world I had known, the small but steady community that had been my home my entire life, had closed its doors to me. My only companion now was the groaning, decaying house on the hill. The invitations, which had already been dwindling since Eleanor passed, stopped completely. The annual 4th of July town picnic was held in the park at the base of the hill. I could hear the sounds of it from the manor's porch, the distant pop of firecrackers, the faint melody of the high school band, the cheerful murmur of voices. I sat there on a broken step, eating a can of cold beans, and listened to the sounds of a life I was no longer a part of. It was the first time in my 58 years I hadn't been at that picnic. I wasn't just an outsider. I was an outcast. I had been quietly, politely, and completely excommunicated from the town of Oakhaven. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in my chest that the wind seemed to whistle right through. Even the simplest interactions became tinged with pity and condescension. When the mailman, a young kid named Tim, came up the driveway, he'd hand me my bills with a sorrowful look on his face, like he was delivering a death notice. "You hangin' in there, Mr. Vance?" he'd ask, his voice full of a sympathy that felt more like an insult. I started talking to the house, to the squirrels that chattered in the oak trees, to Eleanor's memory. The sound of my own voice was a comfort against the oppressive silence. The manor wasn't just a project anymore. It was my entire world, my fortress and my prison. The wind howling through the broken windows became a familiar song. The creak of the floorboards, the house's own language. The work itself was a constant battle, a war of attrition against decades of neglect. For every small victory, there was a crushing defeat. I spent 3 full days clearing the debris from the grand front porch, only to have one of the main support columns, rotted through at the base, give way with a sickening crack. I jumped back just in time to avoid being crushed by a ton of falling wood and stone. The house felt alive, and it felt like it was actively trying to kill me. It was as if the decay had a will of its own, fighting to reclaim the structure and drag me down with it. Each day was a gamble, a test of my body, my skills, and my dwindling resolve. I was exhausted, bone-deep tired, but the thought of quitting was unthinkable. Quitting meant they were right. In the back of the first floor, I found a small room, maybe an old butler's pantry, that was miraculously almost intact. The roof above it was sound, and the floor was solid. It became my sanctuary. I swept out the thick layer of dust and grime, boarded up the one broken window with a piece of plywood I salvaged, and moved in a small cot and a cooler. This 10 by 10 foot space was my corner of order in an overwhelming sea of chaos. It was where I ate my simple meals, where I studied the old, faded blueprints I'd found in a drawer, and where I collapsed each night, my muscles screaming in protest. It was a tiny foothold against the wilderness, a small declaration that I was not yet defeated. One night, a brutal thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that shakes the very foundations of the earth. I lay on my cot and listened as the manor groaned and shuddered around me like a dying beast. The wind shrieked through the eaves and rain hammered against the roof. Soon, the inevitable leaks began, first a drip, then a trickle, then a steady stream of water pouring through the ceiling of the main hall. I ran around with every old bucket and rusty can I could find, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The sound of the water drumming into the containers was a symphony of my own failure. I finally gave up, slumping against a damp wall, feeling utterly small and powerless against the forces of nature and decay that were arrayed against me. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a house filled with new puddles and the damp, musty smell of defeat. I stood on the porch, surveying the new damage, when I saw a pickup truck stopped on the road below. It was Henderson again, this time with a couple of his cronies from the town council. They were all looking up at my ruin, pointing and laughing. Their laughter wasn't the stifled, polite snickering from the auction. It was loud, open, and cruel. Then, one of them cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, his voice echoing up the hill with perfect, agonizing clarity. "Hey, Arthur, need a match to light that bonfire for ya." That single, shouted question hit me harder than any physical blow. It wasn't just a joke. It was a public execution of my last shred of dignity. They weren't just pitying me anymore. I had become the town's entertainment, a spectacle of failure for them to gawk at. The fool on the hill, trying to polish a turd while they all watched and placed their bets on when he would finally give up or get himself killed. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't Arthur Vance, the stonemason, the widower, the father. I was a caricature, a punchline. I was nothing more than the old fool with the worthless property. That was my new name, my new identity, branded onto me by the community I had once called my own. I turned and walked back inside the dark, damp house, the sound of their laughter still ringing in my ears. I went to my little room, my tiny, pathetic sanctuary, and sank onto the edge of my cot. The fight just seemed to drain out of me, replaced by a cold, heavy wave of doubt. I looked down at my hands. They were raw, blistered and stained with dirt and rust. They were the hands of a builder, a man who made things last. But as I stared at them, for the first time in my entire life, I wondered if they were right. What if this is all there is, a pile of rubble and a broken promise? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the smell of mildew. In the crushing silence of Blackwood Manor, I had never felt so completely and utterly alone. But in that moment, sitting on my cot with their laughter echoing in my head, something inside of me didn't break. It hardened. It turned from a hot, burning shame into a cold, dense resolve. They wanted a spectacle? They wanted to see me fail? Fine. Let them watch. I was done feeling sorry for myself. I was done listening to the ghosts of their opinions. I had work to do. Not for them, not even for Eleanor's memory in that moment, but for my own damn self. I got up, splashed some cold water on my face from a rainwater bucket, and walked into the main library. The massive stone fireplace was the heart of the house, and its chimney was crumbling. If I didn't stabilize the core of this place, the rest would surely follow. I would start with the foundation, just like my father taught me. I would start with the stone. The library was a disaster. Books had turned to moldy pulp on the floor, and a thick blanket of dust and fallen plaster covered everything. But the fireplace, it was a masterpiece of old-world masonry. It was built from huge, rough-hewn blocks of local granite, fitted together with a precision you don't see anymore. I spent the first day just clearing the debris around it, sweeping away the remains of a life that ended 70 years ago. As I worked, I ran my hands over the stones, feeling the chisel marks, reading the story of the man who built it. I felt a kinship with him, another stonemason working in solitude. I understood the language of his work, the pride in every perfectly set joint, and that's when I saw it. It was something no one else would ever notice, not in 100 years. It was the hearthstone, a single massive slab of granite that formed the floor of the fireplace. To any normal person, it looked just like the others. But to a stonemason, it was all wrong. The mortar and the joint around it was a different color, a slightly different texture. It wasn't crumbling like the rest. It was harder, more like a modern Portland cement mix than the old lime mortar used everywhere else. And the stone itself, it wasn't set to bear weight. It was set to be moved. The subtle tooling on the edges, the way it was seated in its bed, it was a plug, not a keystone. My heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't an accident. This was a secret, written in the language of my trade, a message left from one builder to another across the decades. For the next 3 days, I worked on that stone. It was a slow, painstaking process. I didn't want to use a sledgehammer and risk destroying whatever might be behind it. I used my chisels and my knowledge of leverage, carefully chipping away at that hard mortar joint, bit by bit. My hands bled, my back ached, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. The work was so focused, so intense, that the rest of the world just melted away. I didn't hear the cars on the road below. I didn't think about Henderson's sneer or Mark's disgust. It was just me, the stone, and a 70-year-old secret. On the third afternoon, with one final, carefully placed pry bar, I felt it shift. A low, grinding sound echoed in the silent room, and a crack of darkness appeared along the edge of the stone. With my heart pounding in my chest, I managed to lever the massive slab upwards and slide it to the side. It revealed not a hollow space, but a solid, rust-covered iron plate set flush with the floor. There were no handles, no hinges, just a flat sheet of forbidding metal. I ran my fingers over its surface and felt a tiny, almost invisible seam and a small keyhole, cleverly hidden in what looked like a patch of rust. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. This was a vault. Silas Blackwood, the man who built this place, hadn't just built a home. He had built a fortress around a secret. He trusted his stone and his steel more than he trusted any bank, and for some reason, that was a sentiment I could understand perfectly. Picking the lock was out of the question. It was an old, complex mechanism. I had to drill it out. It took another full day, and 3 dulled drill bits, but finally, I heard a satisfying clunk as the internal tumblers gave way. I found a small indentation on the edge of the plate, and, using my crowbar, I pried it open. The heavy plate lifted with a groan of protest, releasing a puff of stale, dry air that smelled like old paper and metal. I peered into the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It wasn't a large space, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, a small, dust-choked chamber, and inside, sitting on the stone floor, were 5 large black metal chests, all of them sealed with heavy-duty locks. I had to use a hammer and a cold chisel to break the lock on the first, smallest chest. The sound of the metal snapping echoed like a gunshot in the dead-quiet house. I lifted the heavy lid, my hands trembling so much I could barely hold the flashlight steady. I was expecting, I don't know what. Gold coins, maybe jewelry. But it was filled with paper, stacks and stacks of it, all neatly bundled with string. My first thought was a wave of bitter disappointment. It was just old documents. But then I picked up the top bundle. The paper felt thick and important. The words were printed in an old-fashioned script. "Bearer bond," it said at the top. Underneath, a figure, $1,000. And there were hundreds of them in that box. I didn't understand what bearer bonds were at first, but I knew the other papers. They were stock certificates, not for companies I'd never heard of, but for names that were as common as the dirt on my hands. Ford Motor Company, the Coca-Cola Company, International Business Machines. There were hundreds of shares for each, all dated from the 1920s and early 30s. I sat there on the dusty floor, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was looking at. This wasn't just a box of old paper. This was a fortune, frozen in time. A fortune that Silas Blackwood had locked away before the world fell apart, and which had been sitting here, silently multiplying, for over 70 years. The next chest I opened was even heavier. When I finally broke the lock and lifted the lid, the beam of my flashlight caught a dull, buttery gleam. My breath caught in my throat. It was gold. Not coins, but solid bars, each one stamped with its weight and purity. There were dozens of them, stacked like bricks. I reached in and picked one up. The sheer weight of it was shocking, a solid, undeniable reality in my hand. It was cold and smooth, and it felt like the anchor of the world. In that moment, the laughter from the town hall, the whispers, the pity, it all seemed like it was coming from a different planet, a distant, foolish world that had nothing to do with the solid truth I was holding in my palm. And this is the part of the story no one knows. This is the secret I've held in my heart all this time. You see, I didn't tell a soul. Not Lily, not a lawyer, not a single person. Why? Because the minute I saw that gold, I saw their faces. I saw Henderson's greedy little eyes. I saw Mark's sense of entitlement. I saw the whole town, who had branded me a fool, suddenly lining up with their hands out, telling me it was, quote, community property, that I owed them a piece of my luck. They would have torn it apart, and me along with it. This treasure wasn't luck. It was a reward for faith. It was Eleanor's dream, and I would be damned if I was going to let their greed tarnish it. So I closed the lid, slid the hearthstone back into place, and went about my work as if nothing had happened. It took me a month of quiet trips to the city library, looking up old stock records, and the historical price of gold. I was careful. I used payphones to make discreet calls to a financial advisor in a city 3 states away, a man who had no idea who I was or where I was calling from. The numbers were so big they didn't seem real. The stocks, after all the splits and dividends over 70 years, were worth a staggering amount. The bonds, still valid. The gold, well, gold is always gold. The conservative estimate, the number the man on the phone gave me in a hushed, awestruck voice, was just over $200 million. I hung up the phone, walked out of the station, and sat on a bench, watching the traffic go by. I had $500 to my name, and I was one of the richest men in the country. And in that moment, the entire world shifted on its axis. The power dynamic, the one where I was the pathetic fool at the bottom, and they were the sensible, respectable people looking down on me, it didn't just level out. It inverted completely. I held all the cards, their opinions, their judgments, their laughter. It was all based on a reality that no longer existed. It was the pathetic squawking of birds who had no idea the man they were mocking owned the entire forest. A strange sense of calm washed over me. I didn't feel anger or a need for revenge. I just felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. The game was already over. I had already won. They just didn't know it yet. They all underestimated me. They saw a simple man, a stonemason with dirt under his fingernails and grief in his eyes. They saw my patched-up clothes and my beat-up old truck, and they made their judgment. They assumed that because I was poor, I was also stupid. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. They never once considered that a man who spends his life working with stone understands the value of a solid foundation. They never imagined that my hands, which they saw as symbols of my lowly station, were the very keys that could unlock a secret they were blind to. They judged the surface, the crumbling facade, and never bothered to look at the structure underneath. This was never just about the money. The money was the tool, not the prize. The prize was the fulfillment of the promise I made to Eleanor on that hill all those years ago. The discovery didn't feel like I had won a lottery. It felt like the house itself, the castle in the clouds, had given us its blessing. It was as if her faith in the place had been stored up in those stones all this time, waiting for the right hands to release it. The fortune was a means to an end. And the end was to build the life she and I had dreamed of, a beautiful, strong, and lasting home for our daughter, a testament to what we could build together, even after she was gone. So I made a plan. A quiet, simple plan. I would not announce my wealth. I would not confront my tormentors. I would not rub their faces in their ignorance. What would be the point? Their validation meant nothing to me anymore. My justice would be silent. It would be in the sound of my hammer, in the quality of the new slate for the roof, in the gleam of the new copper gutters. My victory would be in the slow, steady restoration of Blackwood Manor, a transformation they would all witness from a distance, a miracle they would never be able to explain. They would be left to wonder, to speculate, and to gossip amongst themselves, forever on the outside of a truth they were too blind to ever see. They called me the King of the Ruins, and in a way, they were right. I was the king of a kingdom they couldn't see, ruling over a treasure they could never imagine. While they were laughing, I was laying the foundation for a new life, a life of dignity, security, and peace. I kept working with my old tools in the daylight, letting them see the struggling fool they wanted to see. But at night, I would sit in my small room, with the faded blueprints spread out before me, and I would plan the resurrection of Blackwood Manor, not as a pile of rubble, but as a monument to a love that was stronger than stone, and a promise that was more valuable than gold. My final decision wasn't made in a flash of anger or a desire for grand revenge. It came to me slowly, over several nights, as I sat in my little pantry room, listening to the old house breathe around me. I thought about what Eleanor would have wanted. She was never one for showing off or putting on airs. She wouldn't have wanted me to buy a fancy car and parade it down Main Street just to see the looks on their faces. She would have wanted the dream we shared, pure and simple, our castle in the clouds, brought back to life not as a monument to wealth, but as a home filled with love and safety for our daughter. And so, my plan became clear. I would not become a spectacle. I would not give them the satisfaction of a fight or an explanation. I would simply build. I would use this incredible gift to fulfill my promise to her, and in doing so, build a fortress of peace around myself and Lily, a place where their judgment could never reach us again. The strategy had to be one of absolute silence. To the town I would remain Arthur Vance, the struggling stonemason. I continued my small repair jobs around Oakhaven, patching fences and fixing steps, letting them see the man they expected to see. But my real work was happening behind the scenes. I hired a historical restoration architect from a firm 2 states away, a man who only knew me as a client with a passion project and the funds to back it up. We met in secret, in diners in far-off towns, poring over the original blueprints. The materials, the Vermont slate for the roof, the heart pine for the floors, the custom-milled windows, were ordered through his firm and delivered by trucks with no local markings. I paid for everything through the trusts my financial advisor had set up, creating a paper trail so complex and distant that no one in Oakhaven could ever hope to follow it. I was a ghost, funding a resurrection right under their noses. The first visible change was the roof. One morning, a massive crane and a crew of unfamiliar workers arrived at dawn. They weren't the usual local guys. They were quiet, professional, and worked with a speed and precision that was foreign to Oakhaven. They stripped the old, rotten shingles and began laying down the new slate, each piece a perfect shade of dark gray. Gleaming in the sun, I could feel the town holding its breath. I saw Henderson's car slow to a crawl on the road below, his face a perfect picture of confusion. Mark drove by that evening, not even trying to hide his disbelief. I heard the whispers start up again at the grocery store, the theories flying. He must have taken out a monstrous loan. He's in debt up to his eyeballs. He's crazier than we thought. They saw my dream taking shape, and all they could imagine was a bigger, more spectacular failure. They couldn't conceive of success. It simply wasn't in their vocabulary when it came to me. A few months later, as the exterior of the manor was slowly being reborn, news spread through town that the Oakhaven Library, the very one my father had laid the cornerstone for, was on the verge of closing. The town's budget was a disaster, and the council, with Mark at the forefront, announced the cuts with deep, theatrical regret. I read about it in the local paper, my heart aching at the thought of that beautiful stone building being shuttered, so I made another call to my advisor. The next week, at a town hall meeting filled with despair, the mayor announced a miracle. An anonymous donation, channeled through a prestigious law firm in the city, had been made. It was enough to save the library, renovate the children's wing, and secure its endowment for the next 50 years. Henderson and Mark stood at the podium, basking in the glory, hinting that their leadership had attracted this mysterious benefactor. I watched a recording of the meeting online, and I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. That was my justice, not in tearing them down, but in building up the very things they were letting fall to ruin. Now, years later, I sometimes stand on the finished veranda of Blackwood Manor, a cup of coffee in my hands, and look down at the twinkling lights of the town. The house is whole again, strong and beautiful, filled with the warmth and laughter of Lily and her own young family when they visit. They still don't know the full story, only that I worked hard and got lucky. Down in the town, the people still wonder. They've concocted a dozen different stories to explain my fortune. A long-lost relative, a winning lottery ticket. Anything but the truth their own judgment blinded them to. They never saw the value in the rubble, and they never saw the man standing in the middle of it. The real treasure was never the gold in the floor. It was the promise I kept. It was the quiet dignity of building a life out of what everyone else had thrown away. I didn't need their applause. I had my peace. And I had finally, truly, come home.